heat shock protein, that's really kind of a misnomer. It's way more than temperature. These are basically stress shock proteins, and that's the real key here. And look at some of the unifying factors of what does it. Sure, heat and cold shock, oxidative stress, heavy metals, toxins, protein overexpression, nutrient deprivation, and hypoxia. These are all stresses that we come across, and these are stresses that can make us or break us, so to speak, okay? So what can cause some of that? What are some of the mechanisms? Well, you have increased protein damage. You have proteostasis disruption, inflammatory signaling, exercise and cardiovascular stress, and temperature extremes. Okay, so basically, like a lot of things, like most things in the biological world, it's all the hormesis effect. You have low-level heat stress and hormesis. You have high-level heat stress and damage. And we see that diagram right here. This is the real key in all the biological world. That sweet spot of oxidative stress or whatever it is can make or break you. Now, let's talk about the basics. Proteins, okay? What are they and what do they do, okay? Well, they're the workhorses of the cell. No matter what you do, if your proteins don't work, you're not going to be, your kinases, all your enzymes, they're all protein in nature. Your cellular things, your mitochondria, all these things come into regulation here, and that's why they're so important. Okay, so the proteostasis network, well, we start out with, transcription factors. They basically give those genes directions as to what to do. Then you have the chaperone activity. Remember now, chaperones are like a helicopter parent. They're always over their little kid, watching him, making sure he does okay. And then you have the client proteins. We'll get into that. Then we have protein degradation. You got to get rid of these proteins once they're old and once they have problems. So that's all kind of together. This is basically the essence of my whole talk, right here in this one slide. And I'm more than happy to send anybody the PDF of the thing. So ubiquitination, what is that? Well, basically, it's a way that we remove unwanted or damaged proteins rapidly. That's the key, rapidly, because we have to get rid of these things, have guys take their place. And you can see all the functions here. Look at everything. Transcription regulation, autophagy, cell cycle checkpoint, DNA replication, mitochondrial damage, on and on and on. Now, I want you to realize ubiquitin, which is what we're talking about here, is not the same as CoQ10, okay? Much different, okay? So a denatured protein, well, you can see here on the diagram, look at that. You have a normal protein, and then the denatured protein, it kind of loses its shape. It kind of gets to be like a ribbon. We have to try and salvage those proteins if possible, and that's what the heat and cold shock proteins, or the stress shock proteins, I should say, do. So reasons why they become misfolded, well, you have mutations, you have reproduction errors, environmental stresses, defective chaperones, and then you have cellular aging, macromolecule crowding, protein overexpression, you have altered cellular conditions, and damaged proteins, okay? So what basically helps prevent the heat shock proteins from becoming denatured? Because if they become denatured, then you're in trouble. There's nothing to really fix that denaturing. So they basically are bound to ATP. ATP kind of protects them somewhat. They also basically think of them as a hovering parent, just like I said. So a chaperone heat shock protein is a hovering parent. Okay, so basically it helps to fold other proteins in place. How your proteins fold is how that cell is going to basically function. And remember now, all the processes it deals with, protein synthesis, transport, degradation. Remember your mitochondria, they have all these proteins in there, and if they don't work well, again, you're in trouble, okay? So basically, we look at the location of these chaperones. They're found in all the different compartments of the cell. The structure, basically, they're found in the hydrophilic regions of the proteins. They regulate pretty much everything. And the diseases, we got to talk about the practical stuff too. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's. And guess what? Look it up now. Diabetes, we think, is probably a protein folding disease. Interesting. We'll get into that in a little bit. So how do they work? Well, you can see there in the diagram, the one on the left, at least my left over here, you have the, the client protein and the chaperone protein. And then you see how these proteins can go do their work. A nice little cartoon, but it kind of is the essence of what we're talking about somewhat. So now the client protein, the protein that you want to make sure folds into that cell properly. That's basically a folding protein that has to be put into that cell in the right place at the right time in the right position, okay? So think of the client protein as the newborn baby. You have the hovering parents and you have the newborn baby. And that newborn baby, you want to raise it up and make sure it does well and does things the right way. Now, a great diagram here. We can see on the left, you have the client and the chaperone. They're kind of apart, but then that client and chaperone come together. The chaperone keeps an eye and basically wants to make that client protein do its thing. And you can see on the right, you have the diagram with the cytoplasm and then the nucleus itself. Okay, now, next thing we talk about is the heat shock response. Okay, so basically heat shock transcription factors. Remember, a transcription factor gives the genes instructions. And that's what we're doing here. So that's what it does. Now, it helps to bind the heat shock elements and the heat shock proteins. There's kind of a reverse loop. We'll get into that shortly. But you can see it here. So they kind of hang out in the cytoplasm. But like any transcription factor, it's really trying to get into that nucleus. And we can see on this next diagram here, or I should say right here, it says, as the heat shock proteins rise, they bind to that heat shock factor. It basically prevents it from entering the nucleus. So it's a negative feedback, which is what we need. We can't have these things constantly, being at work, so to speak. But this is a great slide right here, because it kind of sums what I'm really trying to tell you. So you can see here, here's the nucleus. You have the heat shock factor 1, the transcription factor. It gives the genes instructions. It makes heat shock proteins. Those heat shock proteins leave the nucleus. They go out into the cytoplasm. They start giving cellular protection. And what happens? Then they bind that heat shock factor and prevent it from doing anything. However, when a stress comes along, it has to be, those heat shock protein factor 1 gets phosphorylated. So you need ATP. That's why you need NAD, ATP, et cetera, those things. So now you can see how it works, and then it goes back into the thing, and it's one continuous loop, so to speak. Now, let's get into a couple of the specific factors. You have heat shock protein 90. It's a molecular chaperone. Basically facilitates folding of denatured or mutated proteins. It'll analyze that protein and see if it needs to be repaired or just get out of there, so to speak, okay? And it does a lot of essential things like the cell cycle progression, apoptosis, protein trafficking, DNA repair. But look at number 5, promotes the activity of oncoproteins. That's one of the problems that we're running into. There's the good and the bad and the ugly, and that's part of the ugly, so to speak. Okay, so interesting thing about heat shock protein 90, it binds to telomerase, and it's also a progesterone receptor. But what does it do? Well, it has a kinase that works with it. A kinase, remember now, transfers phosphorus groups or phosphatidyl groups from ATP to a substrate. But what this does is it really starts to work on our telomeres. Now you say, wait a minute now, we've got something here that can maybe make my telomeres longer and preserve them? Yeah, interesting. Okay, so basically you can see here now, it gives telomere protection. It basically regulates the activity. It has an impact on cancer cells. That's, again, the thing. And you can see it right here, the competing worlds of heat shock protein 90. You got cancer cells on one side, and look at some of the things, sustained angiogenesis, evading apoptosis, insensitivity to anti-growth signals. Basically, that cancer is immortal, and this helps make it that way. And look at the good. So we need these, but, again, it's like a situation. When do you stimulate it? When don't you? Okay? And you can see here, some of the chemotherapies now are basically heat shock protein 90 inhibitors. So it's an effective anti-cancer treatment, we think. And look at some of the things that it does. Okay, so here we are here as far as the mitochondria. It really has a profound effect on our mitochondria. But if we can kind of finagle this to make it so it makes that mitochondria work much more efficiently, preserves our telomeres, without getting the cancer trap, I think we're onto something. And again, I think if you don't have cancer, this is going to be a great thing for you. If you may have a cancer, who knows? But it's like that with a lot of things. The same thing with IGF-1 and things along those lines. Okay, so basically it promotes proteins, oncogenes, and allows a tumor to get a better, foothold, so to speak. So that's the gist of that. Now, another one is heat shock protein 70. Okay, you can see on top, when there's no stress, it does certain things, but under stress, it does some very interesting things. It can basically resolve protein aggregates. Okay, what's a protein aggregate? Well, remember tau proteins, things like that, and some of your neurodegenerative diseases? There you go, okay? Things like that. Now, what does it do, basically? It, again, prevents protein aggregation. Not so much interested in getting that protein to just fold properly. It wants to prevent these things from all coming together. It also helps in protein translocation, protein degradation, and it's anti-apoptotic. So basically, unfortunately, again, it can help cancer cells survive even though they have levels of high proteotoxic stress, okay? So it can help promote those cancer cells. And sometimes they use that as a diagnostic marker. Elevated levels, basically a bad prognosis. Okay, so it's found, the next one we're going to is heat shock protein 60, found in the mitochondria. What does it do? Again, protein folding. Mitochondria now, to me, that's the most important aspect of all anti-aging medicine. Your mitochondria are healthy, you're healthy. They're not, you're not. Cell protection, immune regulation. Okay, this is very profoundly tied with the immune system. And autoimmunity. A lot of autoimmunity diseases we think are now some of these protein misfolding diseases, so to speak. So basically, you can see here how it works with the adaptive immune system and the innate immune system. It functions on both. And remember, your immune system, immune senescence, etc., is how you're going to be healthy or not healthy. Okay, so we can see here, again, it's located in the cell membrane, it's located in the mitochondria, the cytoplasm, it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous, so to speak. Okay, now, cold shock proteins. You know, I come from Florida, and the only cold shock proteins we have is basically the cold plunge pools. I mean, the coldest my pool got this winter was 64 degrees. So there you are, okay? But anyway, what can they do? Well, they give us tissue protection, anti-inflammatory effects. You know, your athletes love the cold shock protein, or excuse me, they love that cold plunge pool. Cancer applications, well, cold shock proteins can be overexpressed. Neuroprotection, very important, okay? And protein stabilization, okay? So what do? You know, it's interesting. They may mimic hibernation. We think it probably is what allows these animals to live in hibernation. And so what we can really do about this is we can take it for space travel, okay? For astronauts, okay? You know, basically they undergo all sorts of stresses in there. And also, actually just from our last lecture with Dr. Kaufman, they help basically preserve your circadian rhythms. So again, we see some important things there. So let's get into more practical stuff. How do we stimulate them? Well, you know, we know a lot of things. You know, the cold plunge pools, you know, infrared saunas, they're hot and things like that. So basically exercise, steam rooms, fever can do it. You know, hot and cold baths, things like that. Thermal therapy, you put a heating pad on or something like that. Intense light exposure. Supplements. One of my interesting supplements, that one there, guaranyl acetone. An ulcer medicine in Asia, off-label, a very potent stimulator of heat shock proteins. I'm starting to give that to my patients. What dietary factors? Well, kind of makes sense. Calorie restriction, protein intake, curcumin, okay? Very interesting thing. The polyphenols, things that we know are good for you. Well, they're stimulating these heat shock proteins, among other things. Anyway, here's that little an article about that acetone, that medicine I told you, the acetone. And it basically is an anti-ulcer agent, okay? So here we can see the kind of the full spectrum of the infrared sauna. Like anything, too much, not good. You just basically have to kind of do it in a gradual basis. And you can see after 60 minutes, we start losing things. But look at it, 60 minutes. Increases growth hormone production times 16. That's pretty impressive, okay? So interesting to keep that in mind. Now, the core body temperature, we think 102 to 104 is good for most heat shock proteins to get your core. Now, that's not the temperature to go into in a room, but your core. And frequency of exposure also is important, okay? So we can see here some of the therapies that we do. You have the heat therapy, you have the supplements that I mentioned, light therapy, 660 to 880 nanometers. You monitor the patient, and, you know, basically you can check his, you know, various studies and things like that. Okay. Now, cold shock proteins, 50 to 59 degrees is the best thing as far as the water temperature is concerned. Repeated episodes are most effective, okay? And they peak about 24 hours after your cold stress and remain elevated for a few days. And there's a lot of variation between one patient and another, okay? So basically, this is a protocol. And again, I'm more than happy to send my slides to you in the interest of time. But we can see here. Now, I like myself, I'm more fond of the whole body cryotherapy. To me, cold water, I just don't like it. But, you know, cold body cryotherapy, it's basically 220 below zero, but Really does some good things to me. Photomodulation, and heat shock proteins, they go hand in hand. Because, again, photomodulation is sort of a stress in some ways, okay? So we talked a little bit about how the dietary things, well, intermittent fasting, it can basically induce a mild stress, increases cortisol, basically activates cellular clearing, it reduces insulin IGF-1 signaling, and it upregulates the sirtuins, which we heard about just before. Such important things. Okay, so how about the specific diseases and things like that? Well, look at the diseases. This is just a handful. There's a lot more that we're going to put there. And if I talk next year, I could tell you it's going to be much bigger, okay? So you have Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's, ALS, viral and bacterial infections, COVIDs, et cetera, metabolic diseases, diabetes, et cetera. So there you are there, the mechanisms and consequences of protein misfolding and aggregation. And you can see that. And again, look at this at your leisure. Okay, so diseases associated with it, cancers, neurodegenerative diseases, cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, inflammatory diseases, including all the autoimmune conditions, et cetera. So now you see how this is kind of putting its tentacles in most medicine. I mean, everything you have there is pretty much everything in medicine, so to speak. Now, how about the cost with these neurodegenerative diseases? Alzheimer's is $321 billion a year, and you can go down the list, but what's the elephant in the room? Aging. Look at what aging cost us. 90%, it amounts to 90% of our health dollars. 3.8 trillion because of the diseases of chronic disease and aging. Okay, so now you see. So let's talk a little bit about pyrin disease. You may know it as mad cow disease, a horrible disease. No cure, nothing that can be done. The patient just basically just goes downhill quickly, and it's a horrible thing. You don't want to wish it on your worst enemy. And you can see what happens to the brain. The brain is just eaten away. And it's just like the cows. And that's why some people say, maybe you shouldn't eat beef. I don't know. I eat a half a hamburger a week, and that's about my extent of beef. Okay, so, all right. So heat shock proteins in the neurodegenerative conditions, you can see when they're working properly, it's going to prevent you from getting those. When it's not working, then you're going to have some problems there. Okay, so how are they associated with Alzheimer's? Well, you have protein aggregations, the tau proteins. And the tau protein is somewhat controversial. Some people say, hey, wait, that's the body's method of maybe trying to help this. I don't know, okay? But protein trafficking, neuroinflammation, mitochondria health. Again, that's a lot of these, all these diseases are because of the mitochondria, okay? But here's some articles here. They basically want to use heat therapy to possibly treat Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Maybe not a bad idea, okay? And you can see here for Parkinson's, it's another type of protein, a SIN that's basically accumulating and misfolding and causing the mitochondria to now function and having all sorts of problems, okay? So, insulin resistance. Go look it up online. Now we think diabetes, at least type 2, is probably, yeah, it's an autoimmune condition maybe, but it's also misfolding of proteins. And if you can reduce the level, or I should say, if you increase the level of heat shock protein 72, the insulin sensitivity dramatically improves. And there's a lot of studies out there that show that. So it's going to be an interesting thing. And this is basically kind of a bit of a confusing scale, but it shows you that when you get those heat shock proteins proper, your diabetes is going to hopefully go away. A lot of good research. So are they pro or anti-cancer? Well, you can see here, yeah, they can make the cancer cells grow, but they can also help our cells stay healthier to hopefully prevent cancer in the first place. So basically, my feeling is, yeah, they can maybe contribute to cancer cell survival, but I think if they make our cells happy in the first place, they may just prevent cancer. So I'm a big fan of using them and going to try and stimulate them. They can also cause autoimmunity. So you can see here, here's one of the literatures I gave you on that, and you can see what they do here. They basically help present antigens to various, remember now, the cells, the eyes and ears of the cell membrane, and those are all peptides on there, okay? So you can see here how it works with the immune system, you know, the CD4 Ts and the CD8 Ts and things like that. Interesting also, I have a guy that helps me do some men's health in my office, and I said, hey, Thomas, you know, this testosterone and estrogen stuff, a lot of it is related to, you know, misfiring of some of these receptors. So now we know that there's a lot of interesting things that go on with that. And basically, aging, declining proteostasis, and cellular aging disrupts proteostasis. And again, look at these at your leisure. And with that, I have 5 seconds. Thank you so much, everybody. My pleasure.